This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nita Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. We're talking about Aetherdrift Limited today, as it's, the most recent limited format on Arena. And today I want to take a bit of a deep dive on some data and give you some cards that I think are hidden gems in the format based on how they're actually performing versus where they're being taken. As usual, when I do a video with data, I'm using 17 Lands data. You can head over to 17lands.com to find all of this data. You can also sign up to have your data tracked on Arena, and it gives us this huge sample size, so many different people playing the format, how it's going for certain cards and stuff like that, and it gives you so much more information than you can ever get as a single person drafting a format. And in this particular video, I'll be using that data by looking at where cards are being picked and what their game in hand win rate is. As usual, I like to have a baseline type card for this type of video so that you can sort of get a feel for what the data is like. The baseline card here is Sky Streak Engineer. It's taken around pick 7.27, and it has a win rate of 55.9%. The overall win rate in this format for 17 Lands users is 55.3%, so this is just like, just a little bit better than average. And I think it's, a good card to choose to be a baseline because I think we can all agree that it's a solid but not exciting card overall. 2-drops are important in this format as they are in most, but a lot of them are defensive, and the Engineer is one of them. It blocks a lot of 2-power creatures, and later in the game it can get bigger, and if you have exhaust payoffs, like the vehicle that draws you cards, it gets even better. So it's, a nice card. And I choose this card as the baseline because every card we're going to look at in this video is taken later, but has a higher game in hand win rate than Sky Streak Engineer does. So let's start with a look at Wild Roads. So this is kind of here as a stand-in for all of the roads, which are all being taken pretty late. Wild Roads is being taken around pick 9.8, and it has a win rate of 56.2%. Now, a decent chunk of the fact that it has this high of a win rate is just that green is a very powerful color in this format. That's something I've been saying, and everyone who's been playing the format at least a little bit has been saying since the format began. It is starting to even out a little bit because now there are enough people trying to draft green that it's harder to get a really good green deck. But, part of the reason and part of what makes data not perfect, of course, is because we can look at Wild Roads and see its win rate, but part of a card's win rate is reflected by the other cards that are played with it, and green being really good is a thing. But I think there's more than that going on here. I think all of the roads, which are all of these lands that enter tapped unless you have a vehicle or a mount, tap for a mana of a single color, and you can pay 1 generic and a mana of that color, tap them and sacrifice them to make a pilot token at sorcery speed. I think all of these are pretty solid cards. I was reasonably high on them going into the format, in the set review, and I think it's mostly panned out that they are nice cards to play. But there are some things going on that I think make them even a little bit better than I expected. One of them is just that games go on long enough in this format. That's another thing I've been saying a lot of. The games in this format tend to go on for a while, that you often have the time to do this. And sometimes when you're flooding out late, just the fact that you can sack your land and get a body on the board makes a real difference, and that body really matters. But the other thing, and part of what I think makes Wild Roads the best of the bunch, is Pothole Mole. I was just talking about how games go on really long, right? So it's not unusual if you're playing a couple of Pothole Moles to have already sacrificed a Wild Roads earlier in the game, and then play the Mole and get Wild Roads back, and then sacrifice it again. At that point, you're getting card advantage, like in a real way, not just a land you don't really need. So yeah, I think Wild Roads is actually the best of all of these because of Pothole Mole, but I think they're good in all of their colors. Like, they're all doing solid or better in their particular color for what their win rate looks like. And I do think they should be taken a little bit higher. Like I said, having a land that is this much better than a regular land is a big deal. And it does come into play untapped a reasonable chunk of the time, too. And between the fact that you can play it on turn 1 frequently, and it doesn't matter that it enters tapped on turn 1 a decent chunk of the time, and the fact that if you have a vehicle or mount, it enters untapped, they don't enter tapped that often. And they come with enough upside to be, I think, better than people realize they are. All right, next let's look at Engine Rat. Of all of these, this one surprised me the most, mostly that people are taking it so late. It's taken around pick 7.28, and it has a win rate of 58.3%. So it has the second highest win rate of any card we're going to look at in this video, and it's being taken pretty late. So Engine Rat is another card I liked in the set review. I mean, it's basically impossible for 1 mana, 1/1, Death Touch to be a bad card in Limited. Like, they're always at least Cs because they can trade for anything, and that sort of effect is a pretty big deal. Your opponent really has to find a way around a pretty massive roadblock no matter what stage of the game it is, unless they have flyers or something. So Engine Rat ends up playing really well because of that, but there are a couple of other things going on in the format that I think make it even better. One of them is just that it works pretty well with max speed. Like, you play Engine Rat on 1, turn 2, you play a Start Your Engines card, and you can often attack with your Engine Rat, either because your opponent doesn't have anything or because they don't want to block with their 2-drop or whatever. So that works out pretty well. But I think more importantly is just that this activated ability is in play way more often in a format that is this slow. I actually had a game the other day where I was flooding out, but the board was pretty stable. My opponent's life was low. They couldn't really do anything, but I couldn't quite get an advantage against them either, except for that I had an Engine Rat in play, and I was using its activated ability to slowly kill them, and I got to 12 mana, which normally I'd be like, man, this is terrible. But at that point, it meant they were dead in like 1 more turn instead of 2 more turns from the Engine Rat. Like, that kind of thing happens. That's not the norm. You don't get to 12 mana in most games, but you do get to 6 in most games. And Engine Rats close out the game a decent chunk of the time when you've got them. And it makes it so that they're like really good, because they're a 1 mana 1 with Death Touch, they're going to be pretty good on any board state, but they're even better in the late game than most effects like this. Of course, they're also really good alongside the green removal spell, like always. Anything with Death Touch is extra good when you can use a bite effect, because then it just turns into Doomblade or whatever. So Engine Rat's really good. It did shock me a lot that it's being taken, as late as it is. When I was looking at the data, pick 7.28. I mean, I'm reasonably happy, like pick 5, pick 6 Engine Rat. And there are a lot of defensive decks in this format that will play some, very happy to play Engine Rat. If you're doing one of the mill decks in the format, which are very real with either Aether Siphon or the rare one, that has an exhaust ability, getting Engine Rats going is a good thing to do. If you're just trying to win with big late game plays or value engines, using Engine Rats works really well. Like, they just do exactly what you want them to do in this format, in addition to just, this card's solid or better in every format. Next up, let's look at Thunderhead Gunner. So this is being taken around pick 7.33 and has a win rate of 56.2%. So red has a serious problem in this format. I love this format a lot, mostly because it lets you do shenanigans. I've mentioned mill decks and value engines and stuff in this video. It lets you do things like that we haven't been able to do, at least since like Dominaria United, at least consistently. And I like that. But green is probably too good and red is probably too bad, and that is a problem. It's hard for things to be perfectly balanced. And I think overall, the fact that this format is as fun for me as it is makes up for that. But it is not a great thing that's true, that red is so much worse than the other 4 colors, and that green is so much better, just in terms of like depth of commons. That's often what determines a color is good in Limited, is how deep it is in commons, and green is insanely deep, and red isn't. Thunderhead Gunner and Lightning Strike are really the only 2 commons that are what I would call good in red. And Lightning Strike is worse than the Gunner is. That's how this format has panned out. So the Gunner is a 5 mana 4/5 reach. That body is pretty sizable. It can hold off a lot of things in the format. Even the 4/4 reach trample worm before it starts to exhaust. Like a lot of key commons in the format, it can just block them forever, whether they have flying or otherwise. So that's nice, and it's weird that that's where red wants to be, but that's where you want to be in every color in this format, is you need nice defensive creatures that have a big impact on the board, and the gunner does. But on top of that, one thing red is really lacking, even when you go up to higher rarities that the other colors have that it doesn't, is like a legit value engine at lower rarity. Thunderhead Gunner's about as close as you get. You need effects that help you grind out a win because you're getting better card quality, because you're triggering things. And Thunderhead Gunner's ability to let you rummage every turn is about as good as you're going to get in red in terms of getting a value engine at lower rarity. And if you have discard payoffs or ways to reanimate stuff, which is a very viable thing in the format too, things get even better for you. So the gunner just, it ends up stopping your opponent on many board states from being able to continue to attack you, and then really improves your draws while potentially triggering some synergy and additional value you have going on in the set. It is fascinating that a 5 mana 4/5 reach is better in this set than Lightning Strike is. I would say choosing which of those to pick over the other, like I would probably still pick Lightning Strike over Thunderhead Gunner, especially in the early going of a draft, even though it has a lower win rate. But that's because, it's removal. It's a little bit more premium. But honestly, as important as it is for red decks to have value stuff going on, the gunner is important too. It also doesn't hurt. One of the other few strategies in red that is really viable is the push the limits build around deck, which yet another example of how wacky this format is. And that's just a deck that's all about, playing a bunch of vehicles and mounts, discarding them, trading them off, etc., and then casting Push the Limits and actually winning. And that's like a real deck. Like Push the Limits has a win rate that is a little bit higher than the average red win rate on 17 lands, which is not what I would have guessed. I gave it an F in the set review. It's the kind of card that I'm sure everyone who reviewed the format gave an F to. But it's a legit build around. And it doesn't hurt that Thunderhead Gunner's perfect for that deck too. It's good and defensive, loads your graveyard with what you need, helps you find Push to Limits. So, it does do the things you need in red in a way that nothing else in red really does. So Thunderhead Gunner is pretty good. I do think it's being taken as late as it is because people are like, man, I don't want to be in red. But if you're seeing Thunderhead Gunner's wheel and stuff like that and Lightning Strikes and the like, it's not a bad idea to jump into red. Let's look at another one. This one surprised me too. Spectral Interference is being taken around pick 8.66, and it has a win rate of 56.3%. So it surprises me it's being taken as late as it is. It's not. None of these are really insane cards for the most part. We're going to talk about one that is, I think, really, really good. Engine Rat is the other one that gets really close, but it's a good card. Spectral Interference, that is. It counters almost everything your opponent does in this format, right? And, making them pay 4 additional is a big deal. Sure, it doesn't stop removal and stuff like that. There are times where it hurts, right? Like, doing the Spectral Interference thing doesn't work out for you. But most of the time it does. And, one of the tips I always give people about limited and counter spells is most of the time, if you have something else you can do with your mana other than leave a counter spell up, do that other thing, because you don't know that your opponent's going to do something that your counterspell actually works on. So you should really only be leaving mana up for Spectral Interference when you don't have other things you can do. And at that point, it ends up giving you a lot of tempo. There are a lot of big haymaker 5-6 drops in this format. Countering those is a big play. Just paying 2 to counter your opponent's Ketradon or whatever is a huge swingy play. Furthermore, it works pretty well alongside Exhaust. That's one of the things I like about instants in this format in general, is if you're in a blue-green deck and you've got a couple creatures in play with Exhaust, you can leave that mana up for Exhaust, and if your opponent does something else, you can Spectral Interference if you have to, and you can Exhaust if you have to. And that ends up being pretty good. That is also a knock against Spectral Interference, because your opponent can play around it if they have Exhaust, because they can just be like, well, they have mana up, I'm just going to Exhaust because they can't counter it. But I think it's more upside than downside, that it's very easy to leave up mana for Spectral Interference, thanks to all the instant speed activated abilities in the format overall. And so, I like having Spectral Interference in virtually all of my blue decks. Do I like it more than Skystreak Engineer, which is taken substantially higher? I would probably say, yeah. I mean, on average, if I have a bunch of exhaust payoffs, the Engineer moves up, but I think Spectral Interference has a bigger impact on more games than Skystreak Engineer does most of the time. But yeah, I think it's a pretty nice blue card, and one that I think should be getting played a little bit more than it currently is. All right, I teased it a minute ago, so I'll just talk about the card that I want to look at that has the highest win rate of all of them, and that is Marshall's Path Cruiser. So this has a win rate of 59%, which is quite high. Like that's like a B-level card, and it's being taken around pick 8.17. So this card is interesting, and yet another card that shows you how weird this format is. This card does not look good at all. In the set review, I gave it a C, and I was like, man, I really hope we have a format where this card works. And my prayers were answered. I was expecting it to end up being worse than I expected and not better. But it turns out this is a format where you can just play this huge clunky vehicle that searches up a land and feel pretty good about it. There are a few reasons for this. One of them is the speed of the format, of course. That's the biggest reason. But it's also that crewing it isn't that hard, and it's actually pretty big. I mean, you can't always crew it. Don't expect to. You don't have to always be able to crew it in this format. But crewing it is much more doable than it appears, because this format is geared really towards vehicles and being able to crew them. And, I talk about how a lot of vehicles in this format are bad, and that's true, but it's the ones that don't give you a 2-for-1 like this does up front. So this makes your mana a lot better. Now, it is interesting to note that the activated ability it has is super hard to activate. Like, this format has pretty good mana, doesn't have great mana. It's got like average mana for a limited format, I would say, overall. And so actually getting to use that ability, that's like the dream. And you can do it on occasion in some decks, especially if you've got some treasure and stuff to help support you. But I think most of the time, one of the fascinating things about the Path Cruiser tells you about this format is that most decks, I don't think, can even activate that ability, and it's still pretty good. Like you would think you'd need access to that 5-color ability for this to really be a 59% win rate card, but you don't. It's probably even higher when you can consistently do that, but I think it's a pretty good card in any deck. If you've got vehicle payoffs, artifact payoffs, etc., it gets even better. But it just ends up being a really reasonable card in a format that is this slow because it adds something to the board and it draws you a card. It's as simple as that. All right, next up, let's look at Bounce Off. It has a win rate of 56.2%, and it's taken around pick 8.24. So 1 blue mana, bounce, target, creature, or vehicle. It ends up playing pretty well in this format, even though, one of the things that sometimes makes a card like this really good is that there are great tricks in the format. This format has one trick I would call great in the form of Maximum Overdrive, a card we'll actually look at in a second. So that's what's interesting, is Bounce Off is good, even though this format doesn't have that many tricks, and tricks are where you can get nice blowouts because you do get 2-for-1s, well, not 2-for-1s, but you bounce your opponent's thing and you get a card. So you trade 1-for-1 and you get tempo instead of just tempo, which is usually what a card like Bounce Off gives you, is just tempo, because you are going down a card and your opponent isn't. But there are a few things here that work out in its favor. One of them is that getting that kind of tempo is one of the ways to get ahead in this format. There are a lot of sort of stats monstery creatures that are really efficient in the format that people are playing. Like green decks are often playing the 4-mana 4/4 with Reach and Trample. They're often playing Earth Rumbler. They're often playing Tarion, the big vanilla creature. Bounce Off feels really good against all of those because usually they make that play and then you can't attack them anymore or whatever. Bounce Off lets you, sure, you go down a card still, but the tempo is so much that it pretty much makes up for it. The other thing is there are enough advantageous things you can do by bouncing your own stuff with Bounce Off that it ends up being quite good. You can use it to save your creature from removal or whatever, but you can also bounce something that's already exhausted that you want to exhaust again, which is sometimes the right play to make, especially if you've got exhaust payoffs around. You can use it to rebuy an enters trigger. There's just a lot you can do with Bounce Off, and it's only 1 mana, and it's rarely useless. Like, it almost always has something it can do. And this format has enough creatures that are just like big that you sink mana into that I think Bounce Off ends up performing pretty well. Mentioned Maximum Overdrive, so I'll go ahead and just talk about it now too. It has a win rate of 57%, and it's taken around pick 9. Tricks always perform pretty well on 17 lands data. I mean, the good ones do. The ones that are really efficient and obviously good. And, you know, Maximum Overdrive checks those boxes. These days, when I evaluate tricks, you know, I give this one a C+ in the set review, and I think that's pretty much where it is. You know, the ones that are capable of winning your creature combat and blanking removal spells are the best, because they have the most use cases. And this is going to virtually always win your creature combat and blank almost every removal spell in the format. So it's not too surprising that it's as good as it is, but I am surprised people are still taking it as late as they are. It is true that tricks are situational, of course, but this trick ends up being useful in so many situations. Again, lines up pretty well against those big green monsters you're always running into, whether it's a Ketrodon or something else. It lets your whatever creature kill their creature, you know? Like, it makes that creature into a much better engine rat for a turn, effectively. And that is just really powerful. It's also a tempo play, except you also trade 1 for 1, unlike Bounce Off. Although Bounce Off is good against Maximum Overdrive, like I mentioned. But this just ends up being good in so many situations that I think you can take it higher than a normal trick. Like, I'm fine with taking Overdrive at like pick 7 or so instead of pick 9, because you're going to have enough things that you can target with Maximum Overdrive that playing like 2 or 3 of them is pretty good. Like, they break up board states in a way most tricks just can't, in addition to all of the other utilities. So it's a card I like a lot that I think should be getting taken higher. So the last card I want to look at here is Broadcast Rambler, which is being taken around pick 9, and it has a win rate of 56.1%. So white has a similar problem to red. It's not quite as massive of a problem. It is sad that like aggressive white cards like the Leonin Surveyor and stuff, they're not particularly good. But there are good white commons. This is one of them. The other one that's especially notable is the exile removal spell that only costs 2 on a tapped creature. But yeah, I mean, I think most good white decks are going to have Broadcast Ramblers in them. And it's just a nice, solid card. You know, it is 5 mana for a 5/4 vehicle with crew 1. And then it gives you a Thopter. It's great that you get 2 artifacts, so if you have like Pact All Terror, it drains 2 life. If you're in blue-white and you've got some affinity stuff going on, it's good with that. But it's just a good rate, too. I mean, there are a lot of board states where you play this, and it's just the biggest thing on the board, and you can crew it on your opponent's turn with the Thopter you got, if with nothing else. And it's just a decent-sized body for what you paid in the first place. And if you trade off the Rambler for their, like, big-ish creature, and then you still have a Thopter, that feels pretty good. And that's an interaction you see a lot. So, you know, kind of like with Thunderhead Gunner, where people are probably taking it as late as they are because they're like, I don't really want to be in red. I think that's true with white to a lesser extent than red. And I think that has pushed the Rambler way down to being taken around pick 9. But even compared to the Gunner, like, it has only a slightly worse win rate than the Gunner. Now, granted, the Gunner is working with other red cards, so its win rate of 56.2% is even more impressive than it sounds. But it's not like the Rambler's working with amazing white cards either. And it has an almost identical win rate and is being taken a lot later, like 1.7 picks later. And I like I said, I think most good white decks in this format have like 2 Broadcast Ramblers in them. Like, that's just how it has to shake out if your white deck's going to be good, because you just don't have access to that many other good white cards. But it is one of them, and it's one of these key cards for white decks to be good. All right, so that is a look at some hidden gems in Aetherdrift Limited. Next week, we'll look at the opposite end of the spectrum. I'll take a look at cards people are taking way too highly for how they're actually performing. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, draft videos of this format and stuff, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.